Let me take you back to the 1910s, a time when life moved a bit slower and folks found joy in the small things around the house and down the street. We'll talk about the hum of phonographs filling the parlor, the rumble of Model T Fords on dirt roads, and the ring of candlestick telephones bringing news from afar. It's all about those ordinary days that still warm my heart. The meals, the work, the songs, and the way we connected without rushing. Now, if we're settling in to talk about home and hearth in those 1910s days, I reckon we start right there in the heart of it all, with the kitchen where the stove stood like a faithful old friend, drawing the family together each morning as the world outside still slept under a blanket of dawn mist. We'd rise with the first light filtering through the lace curtains, my mother moving quietly across the worn linoleum floor in her house dress, her apron already tied as she knelt to coax the kindling into flame beneath the iron belly of that wood-burning stove, the drafts from the chimney, pulling in cool air that carried the faint scent of pine from last night's logs. The fire would catch slow at first, a soft crackle building as she added split oak or hickory, watching the flames lick up until the whole thing glowed with that steady heat that promised warmth for the day ahead. And I'd linger in the doorway, rubbing sleep from my eyes, drawn by the promise of something hot to fill the chill that clung to the walls from the night before. Breakfast came together in that space, simple and sure, with pots of oatmeal simmering on the back burner, the grains swelling in milk brought fresh from the neighbor's cow, stirred with a wooden spoon until it thickened just right, and alongside it, slices of bread she'd baked the day before, now toasted on a wire rack over the coals, their crusts turning golden while butter melted slow from the crock on the shelf. We'd gather around the oak table, its surface scarred from years of meals and mending, pulling up chairs that creaked under our weight as Father unfolded the morning paper, his calloused hands careful not to smudge the ink, and the children, me and my siblings, would perch on the benches, bowls steaming before us, the spoon clinking against tin as we ate. The taste of oats mixed with a spoonful of molasses that came in a jar from the general store, sweet and dark like the earth after rain. That stove wasn't just for cooking. It was the pulse of our home, radiating heat that chased away the autumn drafts or the winter's bite. And on colder mornings, we'd huddle closer, our breaths visible in the air until the warmth spread, wrapping around us like an old quilt, making the simple act of breaking fast feel like a ritual that bound us tighter than any fancy feast ever could. I remember how the aroma would linger long after the plates were cleared, mingling with the soap from the dishpan where Mother washed up, her hands red from the hot water she'd drawn from the reservoir beside the fire, and we'd all pitch in, drying the spoons and bowls on flour sack towels, the routine so familiar it felt like breathing, teaching us from young that home started with these quiet labors. These shared moments where words weren't always needed because the comfort spoke for itself. From there, the day unfolded, but that breakfast hour stayed with you, a foundation built on the stove's reliable glow, reminding us that no matter what fields or chores lay ahead, we had this hearth to return to, this place where life tasted most real and nourishing. And as the fire died down to embers, we'd step out into the light, carrying that warmth inside, ready for whatever the 1910s threw our way, whether it was tending the garden or walking to school, but always with the knowledge that evening would bring us back to the same table, the same stove waiting to light up again. After the breakfast dishes were cleared away and the stove's fire settled into a low simmer to keep the house from cooling too quick, we'd turn to the business of washing up at the basin, that old porcelain sink set into the corner of the kitchen counter, its edges chipped from years of use, but sturdy as ever, drawing water from the hand pump just outside the back door where the well water ran cold and clear, straight from the earth without any pipes or fancy plumbing to warm it up. My mother would step out first, her shoes soft on the packed dirt path, working the pump handle up and down with a steady rhythm that echoed like a familiar song, the spout gurgling as it filled the bucket halfway, then carrying it back inside with both hands, setting it down beside the basin so the rest of us could take turns splashing our faces and scrubbing our hands before the day pulled us into chores or school. I'd follow her lead, rolling up my sleeves to the elbows, the water shocking at first with its chill that made you draw in a sharp breath, but it woke you fully, rinsing away the sleep and the faint stickiness from the morning meal. Using a bar of lye soap she'd made herself from kitchen fats and ashes, rough on the skin but honest in its clean, lathering up between palms until bubbles formed thick and white, then working it over knuckles and nails where the dirt from yesterday's play or father's garden work had settled deep. The basin would fill with that soapy water, graying as we went, my siblings lining up behind me with their faces still marked by pillow creases or the smudges from rubbing eyes, each one dipping hands in turn, the cold making us shiver and laugh quiet-like as droplets flew and landed on the floorboards, which we'd mop up later with a rag to keep things dry and safe from slips. Father would come last usually, after checking the barn or the fence line, his hands broader and tougher from handling tools. But even he took his time at the basin, soaping, deliberate over calluses that told stories of plowing and mending, the water running off in rivulets that carried away the grit of dawn labors, leaving skin pink and tingling, refreshed for whatever lay ahead in the fields or the workshop. We shared a single towel then, hung on a nail by the window where the morning sun filtered through the glass, coarse linen that my grandmother had woven years back, passing it from one to the next as we patted dry, the fabric absorbing the moisture while we shook off the last drops, feeling that simple cleanliness settle over us like a light coat, making the ordinary start of the day feel complete and right. No rushing or wasting water, for it came precious from the well, pumped by our own effort, teaching us early on to value the basics, how a good wash not only cleared the body but cleared the mind too, setting aside the night's worries or the dreams that faded with the suds down the drain pipe that led out to the yard. I'd catch my reflection, sometimes in the basin's still surface before the next dip stirred it, hair slicked back wet, eyes bright from the cold, ready now to lace up boots or grab a lunch pail, but always with that fresh feeling carrying through the hours, a quiet reminder of home's steady care. And in the evenings, we'd do it all again, basin refilled from the day's warmed-up reservoir by the stove, washing off the dust of work or play, the routine as constant as the sun's rise, binding us in those small acts that made our hearth feel alive and welcoming, no matter the season's turn or the world's distant changes. Those washes at the basin weren't just chores. They were threads in the fabric of our days, pulling us closer as a family, ensuring we faced each moment clean and unburdened, with the honest scent of soap lingering like a promise of more good to come. As the sun dipped low behind the hills and painted the sky in those soft hues of orange and purple that marked the end of another day in the 1910s, we'd finish up supper around the kitchen table with the last bites of cornbread and beans, the flavors still lingering on our tongues as my father pushed back his chair and reached for the matches on the mantel, striking one with a steady hand to light the kerosene lamps that hung from hooks or sat heavy on the sideboard, their wicks trimmed short, that afternoon to burn clean and even without smoking up the glass chimneys. The flames caught quick, flickering at first until they settled into a steady golden glow that pushed back the gathering shadows in the room, casting warm pools of light across the scarred oak surface where we'd clear the dishes to make space for the evening chores, those quiet tasks that wrapped up the day's work and eased us into the night. My mother gathering the mending basket with its needles and threads while I fetched the shoe polish and rags from the hook by the door, the leather tins cool under my fingers as we all settled in around the table once more, chairs pulled close so the light fell just right on our hands. Father would start with his boots usually, dipping the brush into the black wax and rubbing it firm into the cracks and creases, the motion rhythmic like the ticking of the clock on the wall, telling stories from the fields as he worked, about how the plow had hit a stubborn root or the horse had shied at a rabbit in the grass, his voice low and even drawing us in while the polish built up shiny under the lamp's beam. And I'd take my turn next, tackling my own scuffed shoes from school, the cloth buffing away the mud from paths and playgrounds until they gleamed faint in the dimness, feeling a sense of pride in making them presentable again for the morrow. Mother sat across from us with her sewing, a torn hem from one of the children's dresses or a patch for father's work pants, spread out on her lap, her needle flashing in and out of the fabric with careful stitches that held strong against the wear of daily life, humming a tune under her breath sometimes, an old hymn from church that filled the pauses between our talk, the thread pulling taut as she matched colors from the spool just so, turning what might have been drudgery into something companionable, the lamp's soft hiss a backdrop to our shared labor. My siblings would join in too, the younger ones with simpler jobs like winding the yarn from the basket or sorting buttons into jars by size and shine, their small fingers busy under the light that made their faces glow earnest and focused, laughter bubbling up now and then when a story veered into the funny, like the time the neighbor's cow wandered into our yard and ate half the laundry off the line, drying stiff on the grass come morning. Those evenings by lamplight stretched out comfortable, the air carrying the faint scent of kerosene mixed with the beeswax polish and the clean cotton of the clothes. No rush to finish because time felt ample then, unlike the hurried ways of later years, and we passed the hours like that, mending not just the hems and sawls but the loose ends of our day, sharing what had weighed on us or lightened our steps. Father's wisdom on planting seasons blending with Mother's recollections of her own girlhood chores back on her family's farm. The lamps burned steady through it all, their light a gentle guardian against the dark pressing at the windows, where crickets chirped outside and the world beyond our walls went quiet under the stars. But inside, that glow held us close, turning what could have been weary tasks into moments of real togetherness, building the kind of memories that stick deep because they were built on honest effort and the warmth of voices raised in easy conversation. Sometimes the clock would chime 8 or 9 before we blew out the flames, careful to snuff them proper so the wicks didn't char, leaving the room to fade into shadow as we headed to beds warmed by bricks from the stove. But even then, the chores lingered in my mind, a quiet satisfaction that we'd set things right for the night, readying ourselves for dawn's return, those lamplit hours a thread in the tapestry of home that wove our lives with care and continuity, reminding us that in the simple rhythm of mend and polish, we found the true measure of our days. Once the evening chores wrapped up and the lamps burned a bit lower to stretch the kerosene through the night, the house would settle into that peaceful hush where the only sounds were the settling of the floorboards and the distant call of an owl from the woods beyond the yard. But then came the sharp ring of the Candlestick telephone mounted on the kitchen wall, its brass bell tinkling clear and insistent like a neighbor knocking urgent at the door, pulling one of us from whatever quiet task we were about, usually my father or mother stepping over quick with a steady hand to lift the earpiece from its hook while the rest of us paused, ears perking up because a call meant news from down the road or across the county line, something worth hearing that bridged the miles without the need for saddling a horse or hitching the buggy in the dark. That old phone stood tall and slim on its wooden base, the mouthpiece a curved horn you spoke into close, the receiver heavy in your palm as you cranked the side handle a few turns to ring the operator at the switchboard in town, her voice coming faint through the wire asking for the number you wanted to connect to. And we'd give it slow and clear, perhaps the line to Aunt Clara's farm 3 miles out or the doctor's place if someone felt under the weather, the connection crackling to life after a moment with static like summer lightning far off. But then the warmth of a familiar voice breaking through, tinny yet real enough to bring a smile or a furrow to the brow depending on the tidings. I'd watch from my chair at the table as Father leaned into it, one hand steadying the bass while the other held the earpiece tight to his side, his words measured and kind as he inquired after the harvest yields or shared how our corn had tasseled early this year, the wire humming with the exchange that made the world feel smaller, turning isolated homes into a web of conversation where worries could be eased or joys multiplied without ever stepping foot outside. Mother took her turns too, especially on market days when she'd call the grocer to check on the arrival of flour sacks or bolts of calico, her voice soft but carrying through the line with that lilt from her Irish roots, cupping the mouthpiece as if to shield the words from the ether, and we'd gather round sometimes, the younger ones on tiptoe to catch snippets about a cousin's new baby or the preacher's sermon points. The phone's bell silent now, but its presence a lifeline that wove our daily lives with those of kin and community, reminding us that even in the quiet stretches between visits, we weren't alone but linked by this marvel of wires strung on poles along the dusty roads. One evening stands out clear in my mind, when the ring came late after supper, and it was old Mr. Harlan from next door, his voice gravelly over the line reporting that his wife had taken ill with a fever, and father nodded along, promising to send over some broth from our pot and perhaps ride by at first light with eggs from the henhouse, hanging up with a gentle click that left the room a touch heavier but resolved, showing how that candlestick brought not just chatter but care right into our midst, prompting acts of neighborliness that strengthened the bonds holding our little corner of the world together. We didn't have lines to every house yet, and sometimes the operator would patch through long-distance calls to city relatives, the delay adding a layer of anticipation as voices from Chicago or New York filtered in faint and wondrous, carrying tales of bustling streets or factory hums that seemed worlds away from our porch swing evenings, yet close enough to touch through the receiver's curve. Maintaining it fell to father too, oiling the crank mechanism on rainy afternoons when the damp could rust the works, or climbing the pole out front to check the line after a storm had snapped branches across the wires, ensuring that ring stayed reliable, steady. Pulse in our home's rhythm that taught us the value of connection forged simple and direct, without the clamor of crowds or the haste of letters waiting on the post. Those calls wrapped up our nights often, the family drawing closer after as we recounted the gist around the lamp's glow, laughter or concern shared anew, the candlestick standing sentinel on the wall like a faithful sentinel, its black enamel gleaming faint in the light, a quiet testament to how the 1910s gifted us these threads of voice that turned solitude into solidarity, making every ring a doorway to the lives entwined with ours, and leaving that warmth to carry us into sleep, knowing tomorrow might bring another jingle to stir the pot of our shared story. If I sit still and let my thoughts drift back down those quiet lanes of memory, I can nearly feel the shape of those old roads under my feet. Most folks today wouldn't recognize how it felt to move through the world when every journey began with the business of just putting one foot in front of the other, leather soles whispering on dirt and gravel, the morning air cool and honest, pockets full of small errands, or sometimes just the hope of seeing a familiar face down by the general store. There was something about those walks, something peaceful in the way the light found the lane as I set out, basket in hand, the world muted except for birds busy in the hedgerows or the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. Sometimes I'd whistle, sometimes just listen to the shush of the wind or the steady tick of time counted out in step after patient step, knowing that in the space of that walk all the clutter of the day, worries about weather or work, melted into a kind of purposeful quiet. The store sat at the crossroads, its white clapboard siding chipped from many seasons, porch posts leaning but strong. Its bell would jingle when I stepped inside, a sound as reliable as sunrise. Mr. Grimes, the grocer, kept a ledger thick with names and numbers, his pencil often tucked behind one ear, his mustache moving as he greeted me with a nod deep enough to say, "Glad you made it." In that store the world seemed smaller, the distance between one family and the next trimmed away by the sharing of hard candy, mason jars, and news fresh from the last wagon in. I suppose a person could walk through a place like that and see only flour sacks and bins of nails. But for me, those shelves held the promise that whatever we needed could be counted, measured, and carried home, tucked under an arm, for the price written plain on a little card. Sometimes, I'd meet a friend outside on that rickety old step, and we'd sit for a minute, baskets bumping our knees, talking about little things. The first snowdrops, who was sick on the mill road, which families planned to marry sons and daughters come spring. That simple business of belonging, of knowing and being known, turned those errands into something more than chores. When the sun swung higher, a warm sweat would gather at my collar, and I'd sling that basket, heavier with flour, lighter with coins, over my arm and head back down the lane. The scent of yeast and fresh print on brown wrapping paper rising with every step. Already thinking ahead to bread baked hot, just as evening pulled its blue shadows over the yard. But not every task or visit could be reached on foot, not when distance stretched beyond what a body could comfortably manage before supper. That's when the old horse and buggy came into play, trusty as rain in good boots. A kind of steady companion that waited after morning feedings with one brown eye on the harness rack and the other on the road, as if she knew, somehow, the pull of the market or a Sunday visit to kinfolk 3 miles past the Grange. I remember the soft give as I pressed my foot into the dirt beside the barn, gripping the wooden shafts, sliding the harness into place, adjusting each buckle so the leather sat snug against withers grown gray in service. Our buggy wasn't much to look at. A plain thing, boards worn smooth by countless passages, wheels that spoke in creaks and sighs on rough roads, a lap blanket folded for chill mornings with the corners knotted to keep out drafts. But it didn't matter. When I settled up on that high seat, reins coiled just so, and clicked my tongue, old Nellie would flick her ears and start off at a pace that suited the scenery and the company. The rhythm of those journeys shaped the day. The wooden wheels would thump gently on ruts and stones, jostling passengers in a comfortable way, the kind that reminded us to brace our knees and keep conversation light so as not to bite our tongues when we hit a patch of uneven ground. The landscape unspooled slow through dusty panes, houses marking the distance with smoke rising from their chimneys, orchards swelling with promise as the season changed from blossom to fruit. Every outing felt a bit like an adventure. Sometimes we'd pass another buggy in tip hats, or spot a flock of geese circling a pond, warbling away from last year's broken bank. Parish children might wave from a gate or chase alongside for a spell, their laughter quick and unguarded, fading just as fast as our horses' patient trot pressed us onward. In colder months we padded the floorboards with wool blankets, bundled the little ones in scarves and mittens knitted by the fireside. The cold air had a way of stealing your words, so we'd ride in a hush, saving conversation for the warmth of a parlor once we arrived. And when the church bell finally sounded its long tone clear across the fields, the buggies ride smooth as we wheeled onto the graveled lane, pulling up amongst a row of neighbors, turning out in our best boots, dusting stray chaff from sleeves before opening the doors. But as the years slipped by, the sound of those wheels began to mingle with a new noise, one altogether different, a kind of chugging and sputtering that first startled the horses and made us all stop and stare when Mr. Callahan's boy drove up the lane in what he called a Model T. At first, I'll tell you honest, most of us weren't sure what to make of it. That funny-looking machine seemed all brass and angles and smelled sharp as hot tar, the engine coughing and wheezing as if it had caught cold trying to keep up with the times. But the day he offered me a ride, how could I turn it down? With a bit of nervous laughter, I climbed onto the upright seat, knees pressed up by the dash, and gripped the door's edge as the whole contraption lurched to life. There was a feeling inside me, something between excitement and the sort of thrill a child gets sledding down the steepest hill, wind pressing sharp against my ears, the potholes bouncing us, so that for a moment your heart sprang loose from your chest, and always Mr. Callahan's boy grinning, as if he'd seen the future and it was painted with dust clouds and speed. That first ride only topped out at 10 or maybe 15 miles an hour, but I felt like we'd broken loose from time itself, flying past barns and telephone poles, neighbors shading their eyes and pointing as if a parade had rolled right into the next decade. The gears were changed by hand, the levers a mystery to me then, feet dancing on pedals in sequence, all while the engine grew louder and the dust rose behind us in wild ribbons. Even when it stalled at the edge of town, spark plugs sputtering out and the bonnet lifted for a lengthy consultation, I remember thinking that something had shifted, not just for the Callahans, but for all of us. After that, little by little, those Fords started cropping up everywhere. A cousin bought one after his third son moved to the city. A storekeeper further down the pike hitched a canvas cover to his, so he could make larger deliveries when the orders came in thick after harvest. Still, for a long while, the buggy and the Model T shared the roads. Horses didn't take kindly to the new noise, but they learned, and so did we. Sometimes, venturing out to market or taking the children to school, we'd catch up to one or two cars, the drivers waving as if to say, "No hard feelings, friend. The road's wide enough for us both." And that was true for a while. The old and the new, passing under the same sunlit trees, each with their own music, the horses' hooves measured and slow, the Ford's engine a hopeful promise rumbling ahead. Neighboring towns that once seemed a day's journey away started to feel closer when the trolley lines were brought in, tracks stretched out like silver ribbons leading right through the center of things. I remember the first time I saw a trolley rumbling up to the stop, its bell chiming over the chatter of the afternoon, painted a cheery green with benches arranged along the windows so you could sit and watch the storefronts slide by in perfect order. It cost a nickel to ride. You'd mark your place in the queue, greet whoever was climbing aboard, and clamber up the broad steps, pressed in close with folks carrying market baskets or a cluster of children with wide eyes, for whom the trolley was magic in its own right. The conductor punched our tickets, the metal teeth making tiny jumps in the pink paper, and then we were off, swaying gently as the electric lines hummed overhead, the car gliding smoother than any buggy ever could manage after a rain. Those rides weren't just for errands, though certainly we made good use of them on laundry days or trips out to the haberdasher's shop when Sunday best needed mending. I recall sitting by the window on a cool autumn afternoon, sun playing across iron lampposts, as the trolley trundled past the schoolyard, the scent of fallen leaves drifting through the open windows, mingling with the sharp tang of metal and ozone from the wires. Sometimes, I'd spot an old friend passing by the market stalls, hat tipped high as we exchanged a quick wave from street to car, promising to stop by for coffee one day soon. In the city, the trolleys knotted neighborhoods together, carrying factory workers, mothers with babies in arms, old men off to share a game of checkers in the square. Even in a crowd, there was a kind of soft camaraderie, each stop a chance to catch up on neighborhood gossip or offer a hand to someone needing help off the steps. The whole city seemed to pulse in time to the clatter of those wheels on steel, a kind of gentle heartbeat that let you know you were stitched into the fabric of 1,000 everyday journeys. But travel, for all its hustle and machinery, was only half the story. There was a different kind of anticipation waiting for the arrival of the postman, his bicycle a blur of spokes, and squeaking chain long before you saw the blue of his uniform cap round the bend. We kept an ear tuned for the whir of metal on gravel, the slap of tires on hard-packed earth. Sometimes you'd catch him from the porch, brown satchel swinging side to side, a reliable smile painted under his sun-browned features, always with a word for how the weather threatened or the harvest was shaping up along his route. It was a special moment, seeing him slow to a stop by our mailbox, an old wooden thing with a rusted flag, perched a little crooked on its post. He'd swing off his bicycle, sort through the letters bound up neat with string or tucked in his palm, and offer up news from a brother in Philadelphia or a cousin a few counties over, each envelope stamped and addressed in a variety of careful hands. Sometimes, there'd be postcards from relatives who'd ventured further than most, sketches of cities with buildings that pierced the sky or beaches flanked by palms. Sometimes, It was just a bill to settle at the store or a catalog promising new wares for the parlor. Still, that mail was more than paper. It was living proof that the world grew and changed but still circled back, always, to home. On special days, if the postman rode in late, we'd meet him with a glass of lemonade from the icebox, standing in the dappled shade of the elm, sharing news from farther afield until his round called him away, pedals ticking off the miles. Afterward, I'd bring the mail to the kitchen table, passing letters to mother, bills to father, slipping postcards and news clippings to the younger ones, watching as each set of hands held their piece with care, tearing open envelopes or tracing foreign stamps, as if the very feel of them could teach you something about the shape of a life lived elsewhere. On those rare afternoons when the postman's route ran late into dusk, I'd sometimes walk the last mile back with him, swapping stories about this neighbor or that, taking the time to set the world to order aloud as the shadows stretched across the road. There was a ritual in that, a kindness exchanged, a burden lifted for a moment before wheels and rubber tread pressed on toward the next stop. Even after I left home for a time, I always found myself listening for the sound of his bicycle coming up the lane, eager for the latest letter, the next thread connecting my heart back to the calm, enduring pattern of those country roads. All these ways of getting around, by foot, by horse, by car, by trolley, or waiting for the mailman's bicycle, wove a kind of invisible web across the world I grew up in, a reminder that even as things changed, the need for real connection ran just as deep as ever. Each journey, no matter how small, brought its own lessons: patience to walk the hard miles, resourcefulness to fix a wheel on the fly, gratitude for neighbors who met your eyes in greeting or shared your bench in silence. Even when the world began to speed up, with engines coughing to life and trolleys humming along iron tracks, the heart of those days stayed slow and true. I held fast to the memory of wet grass underfoot, to the steady feel of reins and harness, to the sturdy wood of buggy seats, to the gleam of brass and glass as that first Model T chugged triumphantly into view, and to the simple joy found in the sound of a friendly voice, carried sure as clockwork along a line of wire or the balance beam of a postman's bike. And at the day's end, as I walked home from store or station, the sun behind me and the world quieted into blue and gold, it was that feeling of having traveled and returned that mattered most, a sense of belonging to a place, to a pattern of honest labor and shared stories, with every step, ride, and letter reminding me that the journey itself was worth every moment, every mile. There's a kind of steady rhythm in a day's labor that stays with a person long after the tools have been put away and the muscles no longer ache the way they once did. Thinking back now, I can almost hear the sound of the rooster crowing before the sun had crested the edge of the cornfield, that old, stubborn bird calling the household to life in the gray stillness of early morning, when the dew clung thick on every fence rail and the world seemed to pause for a moment, waiting for the first signs of movement and purpose. Out on the back porch, half dressed against the lingering chill, I'd pull on my boots with a soft grunt and roll up my sleeves, both dreading and welcoming the hours ahead, knowing they'd hold their share of sweat and satisfaction in near equal measure. The first order of business on a good day was always the field, and that meant the horse and plow before breakfast had settled fully in my belly. That animal would be up and eager before I was, nuzzling at the gate for a handful of oats and a scratch along the cheek, its ears perked for the promise of work. I'd slip the bridle on gentle, speaking softly into the soft, foggy air, and together we'd step out into the long straight rows where the ground waited, thick and unbroken, ready for the blade. The harness was all leather straps and buckles that took time to fit just right. No room for slapdash effort when a day's harvest depended on even pulls and careful turns. Once harnessed up, my hand would find the plow's worn handle, the wood polished smooth by years of calloused palms gripping it tight, every knot and groove fitting just beneath my thumb as if the thing had grown for me alone. There was a ritual to the work, a low click of my tongue, a reassuring pat to the horse's flank, and we'd begin, muscles straining as I leaned my weight into the handles, the iron blade biting deep into the earth, rolling rich, black soil aside with a slow steadiness that kept a man honest and humble. The smell of freshly turned loam always filled my nose so full it felt like breathing in possibility itself, that earthy scent alive with the memory of past seasons and the hope of the ones yet to come. The sun would climb, and sweat would gather on my brow, trickling into my eyes so that I'd pause once in a while, wiping it away with the sleeve of my shirt, lungs filling and emptying in a rhythm matched by the soft, solid thud of hooves in dirt and the creaking song of harnessed leather under strain. The work was hard, no sense pretending otherwise, but there was something about the straight furrows I'd leave behind, row after neat row, that made every ache at day's end seem worthwhile, a visible mark of effort, a promise of food yet to ripen. But not every hand in the family stayed on the land. As towns grew and change crept slow but steady down the main roads, more and more men and women found themselves walking to the edge of the village, work lunch in a tin under one arm, following the low whistle that signaled the start of another shift at the factory on the outskirts of town. My own brother, Harold, took to the assembly line on account of his limp, bad knee from a childhood fall, meaning he couldn't follow the plow the way I did, but his hands were sure and quick on small parts. The first time I visited him there, the walls of the plant seemed to swallow the daylight, brick and glass stretching up taller than any barn I'd known, the inside ringing with the clang of hammers, the sharp call of foremen, whole rows of men and women bent to their stations under the cold gaze of supervisor clocks that ticked off every minute as precious. Harold worked on the line assembling farm implements, iron shovels, hoes, and the like. His task simple enough but vital, fitting bolts to blades with a twist and a hammer tap, moving each finished piece down the line to the next pair of hands. The noise took some getting used to, a sort of permanent thunder in the ears, but there was pride too in the way he kept his pace, never falling behind, sharing a few words and a laugh with the next man over when the foreman's back was turned. They'd break for lunch at midday, all sitting in a patch of shade or along the wall, sharing bread and stories, trading apples for cheese or a bit of meat brought from home, talking about pay and strikes, talking about what it would mean if the machines ever took over for good. Though we all agreed there'd always be a place for honest handiwork. The hours ticked by, and when the end-of-day whistle blew hollow through the plant, there'd be a tired but grateful crew spilling out onto the road, faces washed with satisfaction hard-earned, each one eager for supper and the comfort of their houses as dusk settled over the rooftops. Back at home, if there was time before evening, the kitchen would call. Baking bread for the family fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Most times, I'd leave the field with earth on my hands, washing up at the pump and then making my way inside where my mother or later my wife would be working dough already kneaded and rising under a damp cloth, the smell of yeast thick in the air, a scent that wrapped around you and made you feel safe and rooted, no matter how tired the world had made you. Sometimes it was my job to knead, pressing fists deep into the mound until it pushed back, folding and turning with a kind of energy that left the rest of the day's worries behind, knowing every press brought the bread closer to what it needed to be. The oven, brick-lined and heated slow by the morning's fire, waited ready, ashes raked to one side, the temperature judged by a quick sprinkle of flour on the surface, watching how fast it browned. Into cast iron pans or free-form loaves the dough would go, left to rise once more as the kitchen hummed with the familiar clatter of bowls and spoons, the murmured talk of chores left and plans for supper. When the time came, the fresh bread would go in, the kitchen growing warm even on cold days, the crust browning hard, and even while the inside stayed soft, almost sweet with the memory of grain and careful hands. By the time the sun set, we'd break that bread as a family, tearing pieces warm from the oven, spreading them with butter churned by hand, sometimes drizzling honey from a neighbor's hive on special occasions. That bread fed us through lean winters and harvest celebrations alike. It was hope made real, a way of saying we endure, no matter what the fields or the world had planned. Of course, keeping a farm or a town place intact meant more than just working the earth or the oven. Every so often, especially after heavy storms or when the livestock were feeling restless, I'd find myself out by the fences, a hammer slung through my belt and a roll of wire in one hand, ready to mend whatever the night or the weather had left undone. Walking the fence line was a quiet sort of task, good for thinking, my boots leaving a trail in the soft mud as I checked each post for rot or each rail for the telltale signs of cattle pushing up against the boards. There was a knack to sliding new rails into place, knocking them firm with a mallet so they sat just right, tying the wire tight in a way that kept the whole thing square and the pasture secure against anything that might be tempted by easier grazing. Sometimes, as I mended, I'd be joined by a neighbor or one of the kids trailing along, eager to help by handing nails or holding steady a plank, learning in the doing how. Much of a farm's peace and prosperity came down to simple diligence, the willingness to put things right before they could go wrong. Those hours might seem dull to some, but they brought their own reward. The satisfaction of stepping back, sweat drying on your brow, and seeing a fence line stand straight again, every piece in its proper place, ready to weather another season. Certain chores marked the turning of the year, but some, like delivering ice blocks in summer, came on regular as clockwork in their own time. Before electric refrigerators, keeping food cool and fresh fell to the iceman, a figure as welcome as the first cool breeze after a hot spell. Early mornings, especially when July had settled its heavy air over everything, you'd hear the wooden wheels of his wagon rolling up the dusty road, the horse barely sweating in the shade, while the man worked with long metal tongs, hoisting blocks of ice sod from frozen ponds months before, each chunk dripping diamonds in the rising heat. The ice would come wrapped in burlap or straw, stacked tight in the wagon's bed, and when it was your turn, you'd hurry out with a coin from the kitchen drawer and a path cleared to the back door. The iceman would grin, digging into the pile for the right size, and together you'd carry it inside, lowering the melting hunk into the icebox with a solid thunk, listening to the sizzle as the cold smoke curled out and vanished into the shelves stacked with milk, butter, and whatever winter preserves needed safeguarding from the summer's relentless warmth. Kids would clamor for the frost sloughed off the block, pressing it to cheeks or licking it until numb. A small treat, but bliss on days when the house held the sun's heat long into the evening. That block never lasted as long as you hoped, and sometimes a neighbor might borrow a chunk or trade for a jar of pickles. Good turns exchanged and remembered in the sticky wane of summer, not because anyone kept account, but because even ice was best when shared. Other times of the year, as leaves began to turn and nights lengthened, the sewing basket would come out and stay handy. The season for mending and making running long before there was any talk of new clothes coming from the store. Most everything we wore was sewn in the home, needles flashing in lamplight as a dress was hemmed or a work shirt patched, scraps of calico and wool gathered from old garments cut down for the next in line. My mother, and later my wife, took great pride in keeping us neat, their fingers nimble as they measured twice and stitched once, folding seams flat and securing buttons in a way that dared the roughest play to pull them loose. It wasn't always about making something new, though holidays or special gatherings might see a Sunday shirt or a ribbon bonnet fashioned from a pattern clipped out of the back of an almanac. It was more in the mending, a tier fixed before it spread, a knee patched so it lasted another turn in the field, a bit of rickrack sewn along, a collar to give the old dress a second spring. Evenings might find the family in a circle, the younger children wrapping balls of yarn or untangling lengths of thread, the older ones learning the first slip of a thimble or struggling to thread a needle in the flicker of a lamp. It was work, but it was also patience made visible, love measured in straight seams and even knots, the quiet translation of care from hand to cloth, so that every morning when we dressed for chores or church, we carried a bit of that warmth out into the world stitched into the very seams of our clothes. With all this, a day's work could span from the bright, early hush of morning through the long shadows of dusk. Sometimes, by the time I hung my hat back on its peg by the kitchen door, the moon would already be peeking through the cottonwood trees, and every bone in my body would ache in a good, honest way. I'd slump down at the table, smelling faintly of hay, iron, and smoke, trading stories of the day's labor over beans and bacon, bread torn and passed from hand to weary hand. In these moments, as limbs grew heavy and eyes half shut with fatigue, I always felt a kind of peace, knowing that however small or unnoticed, the labor of my day had meant something, that the fences stood firm, the bread rose well, the crops leaned green and lush in their rows, and those at my table felt the strength of my care, not in words but in the ordinary labor that stitched our household together year after year. Looking back, it's work I remember most, not for the hardship but for the ways it gathered us close, teaching patience, resourcefulness, and the sort of quiet pride that lasts long past the harvest. The plowing, the mending, the fire tending, and the bread making all seem more precious now, not as separate memories, but as parts of a pattern, a rhythm of labor laced through daily life that gave every moment a purpose, every evening a well-earned rest. Even when new means and machines came along changing the pace and nature of things, I've kept in my bones the lessons of those days. That honest, steady work isn't just how we built our lives. It's how we held them fast against the turning world, how we kept faith with each other, and how we learned, again and again, that in the end, every hand callus and every threadbare stitch was, in its quiet way, the shape of love itself. Evenings in those days had their own rhythm, a slow relaxation settling in after the day's work and chores were done, when the world outside the windows faded into soft blues and the house grew quiet except for voices speaking gentle and honest. Entertainment in the 1910s came not from screens or gadgets, but from the patient joy of sharing time. Genuine moments made in the home, at the theater, or among friends at church or school, all carried by music and laughter meant to ease the spirit and knit folks together. It wasn't always lively, nor was it ever noisy for the sake of itself. It felt earned, a kind of reward after the day's labor, steady and rich and plain. On many nights, one of us would step into the parlor where the Phonographs sat, tall and polished, its big brass horn gleaming in the lamplight, waiting to sing. Father would carefully brush the dust from the records, round black discs that felt almost magical in their weight and smoothness, each etched with grooves holding the promise of music and memory. He'd unlock that heavy lid, wind the handle with practiced care listening for the gentle click of the spring, then settle the needle into place. Never rushed, always waiting for the first quiet scratch to give way to song. The room filled, not with blaring notes, but with the happy sound of ragtime tunes, waltzes, and old family favorites, each one familiar as the pattern on the wallpaper or the scuff marks on the round carpet underfoot. We'd gather close, chairs pulled in and shoes kicked off, sometimes singing along in low voices, sometimes sitting back letting the music do its work. Older folks would tap their feet. Children might dance slow circles near the piano stool, laughter mixing with melody as the simple notes painted scenes in our heads, city streets, old riverboats, ballrooms full of kindly faces just out of reach. Mother would hum, her hands resting in her lap, eyes soft with distance as some tune carried her back to days before she'd wed or when she'd spent hours teaching piano to anyone willing to learn. Each song brought something unique, but it was the act of listening together, of sharing that quiet joy, which made the memory stick. Even when the record caught a scratch or the horn sound buzzed, nobody minded. We'd laugh, start again, and know the moments were what mattered, not the perfection. Sometimes we'd end the evening with a favorite, letting the last slow notes trail off until all we could. Here was the gentle tick of the mantel clock and the muted voices talking over what the song brought back. Old friends, years gone, small victories that seemed large enough in the telling. But not every evening stayed at home. The town theater, a place with tall windows and peeling paint, promised a different sort of merriment with its vaudeville shows. There was an energy there beyond the everyday, something you could feel in the air as you approached, excitement humming like the wires strung overhead. Performers came from near and far, never staying long, but each bringing a little piece of the world with them. Jugglers tossing pins and hats smooth as butter, singers belting to the balcony, comics tumbling and landing with grins that made every trouble slide, if only for a moment. Tickets didn't cost much, but even a dime pressed between fingers felt dear, so folks saved up, lucky to catch 2 or 3 shows each season. Sometimes we went as a family, mother in her Sunday hat, father brushing his coat neat, siblings squeezing each other on the narrow seats as the house lights dimmed, hush falling over a crowd eager for the curtain to rise. When the act begun, it seemed the whole community leaned forward as one, necks craned, hands clapping just so, eager for the next trick or clever song. The acts themselves were full of wonder, some grand, some humble, but every one built on skill honed through years of travel and practice. Laughter and applause knitting together strangers into family, if only for a night. I can still picture the faces, young and old, eyes bright with expectation, worries set aside, all drawn closer by the stage's charm. Sometimes a singer would choose a tune we all knew, and voices from the crowd joined softly, filling the old theater with a mix of hope and familiarity. Children watched wide-eyed, lessons learned not from words, but from the way a juggler recovered after a dropped ball, or how a comic's joke smoothed a frown. It was escape, yes, but it was also connection, a gathering of neighbors, sharing a pocket of warmth in a world that often ran cold or hard. Home life had its share of quieter amusements too. After supper, especially in winter when the nights ran long and the fire's glow felt more precious, we'd gather near the hearth, a deck of cards in hand, ready for a few gentle games before bed. The deck may not have been fancy, edges frayed and numbers faded, but it was enough. Rummy, euchre, or a simple round of war meant more than just winning. It was about the half-spoken jokes, the teasing, the way hands reached across the table for a freshly shuffled pile. Sometimes matches were kept loose, with buttons or beans standing in for wagers, laughter ringing out when father lost his tokens and had to promise an extra chore in the morning. The fire popped and snapped behind us, warmth holding the room together, while cards slid on the table, stories sharing space with the game. Mistakes weren't chastised, just grinned off as part of the fun, lessons for next round. But it was the fellowship that carried the night, each game another stitch, in the quilt of belonging. On weekends, and especially when the weather allowed, we might walk to the Nickelodeon down on Main, a small place squeezed between a cafe and a tailor, its front painted with bright reds and golds that promised adventure behind the worn double doors. A dime got you in, cheaper still for children, and once inside the place was dim and full of a special kind of anticipation, 100 eyes fixed on the curtain screen waiting for the flicker to begin. Silent films ran, just black and white images playing across canvas, sometimes jerky, sometimes smooth, charmed by a local piano player who matched each scene with lively tunes or a soft, sorrowful note if the plot demanded it. For many, those moving pictures brought the world closer. Chase scenes down bustling avenues, romances that seemed bigger than the little dramas of our own kitchen tables, comedies that convinced even the most stern neighbor to crack a smile. I remember the first time the Nickelodeon played a serial adventure, the audience gasping and sitting forward as heroes and villains darted through frame, horses racing, villains twirling mustaches, and damsels rescued in the last bright moments before the next reel. The films finished with applause, sometimes more, sometimes less, but always, as we spilled out into the street, faces lit by the glamour of artificial stars, we'd find ourselves talking through what we'd seen. Arguments over plot, suggestions for what might happen next, dreams born out of a flickering light, and the hope carried home to dark bedrooms and long mornings at work. The Nickelodeon didn't just offer escape. It offered a shared sense that the world, as large and distant as it could seem, was in some small way reachable, knowable, and even repeatable in our own kindness and humor. Music had a way of binding the community, and not just inside living rooms and theaters. Sunday meant church, and church meant hymns. In those gatherings, voices joined together, no instruments required, just the pure lift and fall of familiar tunes, shaped by every heart gathered in hope and faith. The church building, simple and plain, echoed with hymn number 14, "Shall We Gather at the River, Rock of Ages," or the seasonal favorites when holidays came around. The sound wasn't always polished, but it was true and woven tight with memory. Sometimes I'd stand in the back, listening more than singing, feeling the weight of tradition handed down through generations, the comfort in how words and melodies never seemed to change as everything else did. And when church let out and the tables were set for socials, long wooden planks crowded with pies, sandwiches, and jars of lemonade, the music lapped over into laughter and talk, stories traded while feet tapped and young folk found excuses to wander the yard in twos. Potlucks were a celebration, really, a chance to gather outside the lines of duty and routine, sharing what each family could spare, enjoying the flavors unique to each home while never asking more than what could be given. The social, with its music and stories, became a kind of second home, a place to be seen and cared for beyond the borders of your own front step. Between the gathering indoors, the laughter on Main, the shows at the local theater, and the moments bathed in the glow of a record's lullaby, entertainment in those days rested on the pleasure of simple things done together. Our joys real and unforced, always about finding a reason to mark the passage of time with something kind, shared, and lasting. The outside world might have its troubles and changes, wars rumored across the ocean, lean years when money ran thin, years of plentiful harvest. But within the circle of family and community, there was always time to play a tune or deal a hand, to sing out loud or simply listen, warmed by the steady pulse of company and the knowledge that no one laughed or wept alone. Looking back, I think what made those times matter was not the novelty or polish of the music, but the way entertainment drew us near, whether under the lamplight of home, amid the painted seats of a theater, or along the pews of Sunday service. It was connection and comfort spun from moments honest and plain. The greatest pleasure wasn't in the performance itself, but in the shared smiles, the touch of a hand, the hush that fell afterward as we stepped out, heads full of story and song, ready for another week, another round, another turn at love and laughter. That's how the best evenings would end. The phonographs winding slowing, the cards gathered up, the fire burning low while voices turned gentle and sweet, telling tomorrow's plans and echoing the promise that with each new day, there'd be time again for music, for laughter, and for the kind of kindness that lingers long after the lights go out. Some things about those old days linger longest in memory, small details you can nearly touch even now, like the feel of starched collars or the shine of well-kept boots, or the crisp sound of fabric when you move through rooms lit by morning sun. When I think about how folks dressed and carried themselves back in the 1910s, I remember a time when what you wore said as much about who you were as any word ever could. It wasn't about fancy brands or chasing fashion for its own sake, but it surely was about care, about doing right and showing respect, every day, for yourself and the people around you. Appearance mattered because it stood for pride, for effort, for a sense of belonging that showed up in the smallest ways, from the cut of a dress to a dab of shoe polish on Sunday morning. You'd often see men fussing with their shirts first thing, especially on workdays, with the high, stiff collars that buttoned close under the jaw. Those collars, cut from thick linen or cotton, needed to be washed, starched, and pressed nearly every night if you wanted to look sharp the next morning. My father was particular about his, laying them out on the table after supper with the ironing board set by the kitchen stove where the heat held steady all year long. The heavy iron would be warmed right on the stovetop, then whisked quickly over the wet fabric while a cloud of steam rose and drifted into the rafters. Once pressed, those collars felt almost like armor, giving a fellow a sort of upright bearing, letting him face the world looking crisp even if the rest of his shirt had gone a bit rumpled after chores. Getting dressed for work, you'd slide the collar in place, button it with care, and knot your tie just so, not tight enough to choke, not loose enough to sag, and there was a quiet satisfaction in touching each button, feeling set and ready before heading out the door. Women's dresses were a world of their own. Long skirts that swept the ground, corsets snugged up underneath to lend a bit of posture and shape, and sleeves that ran all the way down to the wrist, especially in cooler months. If the day was ordinary, you'd see practical matters come first. Cotton prints with small flowers or simple stripes from the dry goods store, fabric chosen for wear and comfort, but arranged always with a kind of gentleness meant to flatter the frame. Dressmaking happened at the kitchen table on rainy days. Mother measuring and cutting from patterns saved in the family Bible, pins stuck in a red cushion, scissors sharp enough to slice through thick muslin or wool. Little details mattered. An extra tuck to help a skirt fall just right, a ribbon sewn carefully at the neck, a few stitches let out or taken in to make the dress last another season as daughters grew and shapes changed. For outings, hats were essential. No lady would step to church or the store without something perched smart atop her head. A straw bonnet for summer, felt or velvet for the colder months, always trimmed with a feather or a bit of lace if the budget allowed. Hats didn't just keep off the sun or mark social standing. They finished an outfit, making a woman stand tall and turn just so when passing a neighbor. I remember my mother fussing with hat pins before big events, sliding them through the crown to hold everything firm against gusts of wind, eyes narrowing in concentration while she checked her handiwork in the mirror by the back door. Gloves were another matter, thin cotton for every day, soft leather when the snow fell, always tucked into a small bag or coat pocket, ready to be pulled out in greeting or worn while carrying parcels down muddy lanes. Men had hats of their own, but none more useful or common in summer than the wide-brimmed straw, woven from long hours of field labor or picked up cheap at a market stall. I can still feel the shade that stretched over my face when I wandered out to mend the fence or saddle the horse, the brim so broad it kept the sun from burning the back of my neck come July. In town, men tipped and lifted their hats as they passed each other, a simple courtesy that everyone understood. Straw hats got battered over time, the edges fraying from hard use, but the best of them would last 2 or 3 seasons if cared for right. Sometimes, you'd see a boy start the season with his father's old hat perched crooked on his head, pride shining out through a gap-toothed grin, dreaming of the day when he'd have one of his own. Shoes were an everyday concern. Keeping them clean was as much a ritual as making breakfast. Saturday evenings, the whole family would gather on the porch or in the parlor, each person bringing their shoes or boots for a good rub-down. First, we'd wipe off dust and mud with a damp rag, then spread out the tins of polish, black, brown, even a bit of cherry for the luckier souls, opening each tin so the sharp, waxy scent would drift through the room. A bit of polish got dabbed onto a brush or a soft piece of cloth, rubbed into the leather in slow, circular motions until every inch shone under lamplight. Younger children watched closely, learning the right angle for buffing, how to keep from dirtying the cuffs of their trousers, how to slip in the laces nice and straight before laying the finished shoe side by side with their siblings by the door. Sunday shoes needed the most care. Scuffs were frowned upon at church, so extra time was spent smoothing away marks, letting pride show in every shining step down the aisle. Boots were another staple, especially when the weather turned rough or the work demanded sturdy footwear. Button boots, with their rows of hinged buttons marching up the sides, offered both protection and style, and every morning found me wrestling with the little hook kept neatly in the bedside drawer. Once the boots were pulled on, it was a matter of patience, working the hook through each buttonhole, snapping the closures from ankle to calf, so the leather held firm against mud and snow. A good pair would serve for years, the soles worn smooth from 1,000 steps up and down dusty roads, the tops polished just enough to keep water out as best as could be hoped. Women had their own version, usually a bit higher, made with narrow toes and graceful lines meant for walking down church aisles or courthouse halls. If a family could afford it, boots would be repaired by a local cobbler each fall, heels nailed back in place and seams stitched up tight, so they could stride into winter ready for whatever cold and wet came their way. Children dressed according to age, need, and budget, hand-me-downs a constant feature of daily life. Pants and shirts were passed from oldest to youngest, patched at the elbows and knees by mothers and grandmothers who worked magic with scraps and clever fingers. Some days a shirt might sport 3 different kinds of buttons, a testament to thrift and ingenuity. Dresses were let out as girls grew, hems reset higher or lower depending on weather and fashion, always mindful of the coming Sunday or a special dance at school. When times were tough, flour sacks and feed bags made their way into the wardrobe, bright prints cut and seamed into shirts and aprons fit for hard work. There was pride in that too, a sense of making do, finding beauty in what could be found and shaped into new life. Shaving and grooming, for the menfolk, was a regular affair. Most kept a kit with brush, razor, and soap set on a shelf above the basin, careful to keep the blade sharp and their chins smooth for the working week. Saturday night baths were the custom, water pumped and heated over the stove, poured in a galvanized tub behind the kitchen curtain. Father started first while mother and the children finished chores or read by the stove. Once he was done, the rest would take turns, oldest to youngest, towels and combs set out for drying and tidying before bed. Hair was kept neat, parted and slicked down with pomade or oil for a proper shine. Boys dreaded it, but went along, knowing that a neat appearance was as much an obligation as finishing chores before breakfast. For holidays and special gatherings, picnics, weddings, the 4th of July parade, folk dressed with extra care. Mothers would press white linens and roll ribbons tight. Fathers would polish boots and brush hats, each person stepping out with a sense of shared pride. Flowers picked from the garden found their way into lapels or hat bands. Cheeks scrubbed rosy and teeth brushed extra bright for photos and close conversation. Those days saw families lined up for pictures in front of porches and church doors, stiff but smiling, records of hard work and love captured for generations to come. Nobody looked for perfection. It was the effort, the honesty, the feeling that a few minutes spent in self-care signaled a respect for the world and your place in it. Bathing and laundry ran on a schedule dictated by weather and water. Cold days meant smaller wash loads. Warmer ones saw whole piles scrubbed and hung out in rows to dry. Soap was blocky and homemade, working its way through dirt and grass stains over hours spent bent to the task, hands bright and raw from scrubbing. Linens and underclothes went up first, then shirts and dresses, each pinned carefully on the line to catch the wind and sun. Sometimes, when rain threatened, all available hands rushed to gather the laundry and bring it inside, draping fabric over chairs and banisters until dryness returned. Folding and storing were a final communal effort, shirts sorted, dresses hung, socks matched and rolled, ready for another round of use. The small rituals of fashion and grooming unfolded within a larger pattern, reminding everyone of their place in the circle of family, community, and time. Whether a person owned 3 shirts or a dozen, a single fine dress or a whole trunk of hand-me-downs, it was the way each piece was worn and cared for that marked a person's dignity and their connection to those around them. In the end, Fashion stood not for excess, but for the discipline of self-respect, the quiet pleasure taken in readiness for the day ahead, no matter what luck or labor it might bring. I remember sometimes standing at the window, brushing my own jacket, watching folks pass up and down the lane. Boys tucked into new pants for school, mothers balancing baskets as they walked with skirts swishing quiet in the morning air, fathers heading off to market with hats braced against a rising breeze, all of them marked by care. The small touches that said, even in a world of dust and toil, beauty was possible, pride deserved, and the simplest attention paid to appearance could lift the spirit higher than any riches ever could. Meals in those days shaped our daily rhythms, marking the hours with scents and flavors that belonged not just to the table, but to the spaces where families gathered, stories were told, and comfort settled in slow and steady. Thinking back, the ordinary process of putting food on the table held as much meaning as any grand event. Simple routines repeated with care, each one a quiet celebration of what the land, the weather, and the hand could provide. There weren't grand feasts most days, but there was always a sense that good food, served honest and with gratitude, held the household together in ways words seldom managed. Summer started it all with canning. That was a kind of ritual in our home, coming around like clockwork when fruit trees bent low with plums, peaches, and apples, the orchard buzzing and the garden patch giving up beans and tomatoes by the bushel. Early mornings found everyone at work, the kitchen thick with steam, the windows fogged over so you couldn't see much but the wavy shapes of the outside world. My mother would line up jars on the counter, tops rattling in boiling water as she tested the seals for cracks, her apron worn and dusted with flour, but always tied snug for the day's chores. Peaches were peeled and sliced, the juice sticky between fingers, then packed tight in jars, and topped with a syrup richer than anything you could buy in the store. Lids were set and twisted shut, each one turned upside down and back again until that magical pop of sealing came through, meaning that in the cold months, when snow stretched across the fields, we'd have a reminder of summer's sweetness. Everyone chipped in. Children carried jars or fetched more fruit. Older folks stirred pots on the stove and wiped down counters. Laughter running through the kitchen as stories of past seasons came up, each one spiced with a different memory. Tomatoes found their way into glass, beans too, with spices and herbs tucked between for flavor, all put up on shelves built sturdy by hand and marked year by year, the pantry filling with color and promise. There was pride in those rows, more than in any new purchase or fancy package, because every jar represented hard work and hope, a kind of insurance against lean years, and a comfort that even in the hardest winter, spring would come again, and with it, another round of chores, gifts, and plenty. Sunday roasts were another cornerstone, a tradition that brought everyone together even when the week had been hard. Sunday morning began with slow preparations. The main course chosen early, a young chicken, sometimes a pork shoulder, sometimes a ham saved for special occasions. The oven was stoked to a steady heat. The fire built up with good wood so the temperature stayed true, and pans placed so the fat rendered out and mingled with potatoes nestled around the meat, soaking up every bit of flavor. The smell filled the house early, chasing away any lingering tiredness from a few extra moments of sleep. On these days, the table was set with care, linens brought out from the bottom drawer, plates arranged in neat stacks, and the best serving spoon set ready, polished to a warm glow. Grace was said before the carving, each person bowing their heads just long enough to whisper thankfulness for the food, the roof, and the hands that prepared it. There was a sense of ritual, not showy or heavy-handed, just a gentle pause before the first slice, a way to honor both the meal and the people around it. Roast meat warmed the bellies, but the side dishes stood out, too. Root vegetables, carrots, turnips, onions from their bins in the cellar, scrubbed, chopped, and simmered along. Bread, baked fresh that morning or saved from the day before, was passed with butter, sometimes with a spoon of jam. Extras found their way onto plates. Pickles from summer jars, maybe a pie cooling by the window for dessert, its crust golden and flaking with the sweet spicy scent of cinnamon and apple. Conversation filled the spaces between bites, stories rolling out easy and true, everyone more relaxed than any night of the week. Laughter, sometimes a song in low voices, or even just the sound of forks scraping plates would blend with the creak of the old table, reminding you that this, more than anything else, was what togetherness meant. When the meal wound down, plates cleared, and leftovers packed away, the table stayed bare for a long moment, a kind of silent gratitude lingering in the air, settling gently before anyone hurried off to the next chore. Treats were rarer but treasured, especially trips to the soda fountain at the drugstore. Market errands often ended with a stop at the counter, stools lined up and the glass case shining with jars of candy and slices of pie. The soda jerk, usually dressed in white, would fix up root beer or cherry sodas with a practiced hand, pouring fizzy syrup over crushed ice, then topping each glass with a swirl of whipped cream that seemed bigger than a child's dream. Waiting for your turn always held a kind of magic. The sound of spoon on glass, the hiss of seltzer, the anticipation as nickels were pressed into palms and slid across the counter. Taking that first icy sip, the bubbles sharp on your tongue, each flavor so cool it brought memories of shade and summer picnics, was a delight that needed no words. Sometimes, if there was time, you'd linger, talking with the druggist, exchanging news and gossip, while the afternoon sun played through colored bottles along the shelves. Soda fountain. Outings were never hurried. They belonged to slow days and small pleasures, markers of treats earned and savored, and a reminder that sometimes, simple joy lay within reach, sweet as syrup, bright as laughter. Pies were a staple as well, baked from scratch on days when fruit came ripe or when special occasions called for something more than the usual fare. Apples were most common, picked from trees gnarled and steady behind the barn, peeled with care, and piled high in bowls as mothers and daughters debated the virtues of different spices. Crusts took patience. The dough rolled to just the right thickness on floured boards, every crack or tear patched and smoothed, edges pinched and tucked for beauty as much as practicality. Pies were filled and set to bake. The oven door opened and shut with anticipation, hands checking for doneness by scent as much as sight, the house filling with the warmth and expectation that only a good bake could bring. Sometimes pies bubbled over, their sweetness running onto the rack or blackening the crust, but even then, the pleasure of serving a thick, firm slice, warm, rich, and needing nothing but a splash of milk, made any flaws seem honest and good. Pies marked birthdays, harvests, reunions, and farewells, each one eaten not just as food, but as testament to love, effort, and tradition. The evening meal, often simpler, relied on what the land or market provided. Fish, caught in the creek not far from the house, made for a fresh and satisfying supper on lucky days. Rods were kept near the porch, hooks and bait ready for an hour's escape to the banks, where quiet and patience waited alongside the water's gentle murmur. Catching fish required a kind of steadiness, an ability to sit with yourself, to listen and watch for the subtle pull that signaled a bite. When the catch was good, it was brought home swift, cleaned and rinsed, then dusted with cornmeal and fried in a pan over a hot flame, the crunch and aroma calling everyone in. Fish suppers tasted of the river, of memories too, shared stories about the ones that got away or the big catches from years past, each tale growing in size and glory with the telling. It was here, in the simple act of catching, preparing, and eating, that the partnership with nature felt closest, a reminder that bounty relied on skill and patience, and that even small things could make a meal memorable. Lunches tended to be plain, whatever could be carried in a pail or wrapped in a cloth before heading to the field, school, or factory. Slices of bread, maybe a wedge of cheese, boiled eggs, apples pocketed from the cellar, and sometimes cold meat left over from supper. Meals were taken wherever work permitted, a spot under a shady tree, the edge of a bench, or the quiet corner of a yard. Breaking bread together meant more than just staving off hunger. It was an act of fellowship, a pause in effort, a moment to connect over flavors both nourishing and familiar. Sometimes salt was sprinkled on apples or bread was dipped in coffee. Small rituals passed down and cherished, carrying the family's habits into the day's work and rest. Preserving food was a necessity, done with a kind of wisdom honed by generations. Aside from canning, salting and smoking kept meat safe through winter, with hams hung from rafters in the smokehouse where fires of hickory and applewood burned slow and fragrant. Vegetables were packed in sand or straw, kept in root cellars dark and cool, each been checked for spoilage and sorted by color and touch. Seeds were saved from the best of the crop, dried and stored in jars on high shelves, marked with handwritten labels that told of careful planning season to season. Nothing was wasted. Leftovers became soup, bones were boiled for broth, and scraps found their way to animals or compost, making the cycle whole. Every bit of food had its place, every process its purpose, taught not in school but in the kitchen and the field, through patient repetition and gentle correction. Breakfast depended on the weather and the week. Sometimes oatmeal, golden and thick, sweetened with molasses and milk poured straight from the morning's milking. Other days, there were eggs, scrambled in butter or fried with a slice of bacon, the fragrance filling rooms and setting the tone for work ahead. Pancakes marked special mornings, their edges crisp and soft inside, sometimes topped with berries caught at sunrise, a treat for those who woke early and helped with chores before breakfast. Coffee was brewed strong for the adults, poured into thick mugs and drunk slow as boots were laced and plans made for the day, each sip grounding the memory of what breakfast stood for: renewal, care, and a small pleasure taken as the sun pushed above the horizon. Holidays transformed meals into celebrations. Christmas brought goose or turkey, stuffing rich with herbs and fruit, tables loaded with roasted roots, and pies stacked 3 high for guests and kin. Thanksgiving was a feast: roasted turkey, cranberry sauce from wild berries picked at the edge of the field, bread and pumpkin pie, all served in laughter and gratitude. Easter meant eggs boiled and dyed with colors from beets or onion skins, baskets filled, and the first fresh greens tossed with vinegar and salt for the season's change. Each holiday meal carried traditions older than memory, recipes whispered from grandmother to granddaughter, tricks for making crusts flaky and sweets tender, all kept safe in the rhythms of family life. Food was never just survival. It was the story told and retold, part of how we made sense of the world and our place in it. Sitting at the table, spoon in hand, head bowed for a moment's grace, you understood that what was served came from work and chance, from sun and rain, from luck and labor mixed in ways no one could fully explain. There was pride in sharing, in making enough to give away, in saving a slice of pie for a neighbor in need, or packing extra sandwiches for the field hand without kin. Food bound us together, gave structure to our joys and our hardships, marked beginnings and endings in the gentle passage of days. As night settled in, and the kitchen grew quiet except for the clink of pans and the murmur of old songs sung low, there was a sense that the heart of the home lay in what had been cooked, tasted, shared, and cherished. Even now, the scent of beans simmering slow or the crisp of fried fish calls back memory, reminding me of hands and voices gathered close, of a time when meals filled not just bellies, but lives. If you want to know how much the world has changed, you only have to think back on what schooling meant back during my boyhood, when a place of learning looked nothing like the great brick buildings full of shining desks and neat hallways you see in town today. The heart of our education was the one-room schoolhouse, a simple wood building set just close enough to the crossroads that all the families in the area could make the walk, no matter how far their fields or how tangled the roads had grown since the last snowstorm or rainy week. Most mornings, I'd set off well before sunup, boots laced tight, the sounds of home falling quiet behind me as I followed the path that curved past neighbors' pastures and through the stand of old sycamores by the creek. In winter, you'd puff clouds in the crisp air, hands shoved deep in your pockets around a biscuit or two for your breakfast, clutching your satchel with books wrapped in twine, your body hurrying as fast as your breath and the drag of cold would let you. It took determination to walk those miles, but nobody thought it a hardship. It was the shape of life, as steady as chores and meals, a journey measured not only in distance, but in the growing sense of possibility that built each step. Sometimes you'd walk with a sibling or a neighbor's child, the two of you swapping stories, marveling at the prints left by deer or the way the light caught the ice on the weeds. Other days, the way would be all your own, with only the promise of learning and a bit of mischief among friends pushing you onward. School started at 8, so you learned young how to gauge the climb of the sun, moving quick when the sky had already gone pale and the crows began calling each other from field to field. Inside that schoolhouse, row upon row of wooden benches filled the space, rough-hewn and marked by dozens of names scratched in by restless hands in colder months. At the front stood the blackboard, vast and blank as a fresh-plowed field at dawn, and behind it the teacher, a figure who, whether strict or gentle, shaped the feel of every lesson and the rhythm of every day. Our teacher kept order with her voice and a watchful eye, using the switch less than you might think, more often setting us straight with a word, a raised eyebrow, or her habit of rapping her knuckles on the desk when the noise grew too thick. The youngest crowded up front with slates balanced on their knees. The older students gathered further back, working through sums and spelling while the youngest learned their letters. It was an arrangement that meant you learned from everyone, your elders, your juniors, even your own mistakes called out for the good of the group. The McGuffey Reader was our constant companion, a book as familiar as the family Bible, its stories and scripts memorized year after year until we could recite them without looking, understanding not just the words but the lessons tucked in between. There wasn't just reading or handwriting, though both mattered plenty. Arithmetic filled the mornings too, each of us lining up at the blackboard to have our figures checked, a mouthful of chalk dust almost as constant as the taste of bread at noon. Sums grew more complicated as we advanced, but the praise was always the same. A nod from the teacher, a word of encouragement, occasionally a feather stroke of pride when you got all your answers right or figured out something your older brother had fumbled with a year before. The schoolhouse heated with a single stove, set right in the center so that in cold weather we could cluster our feet around it, hands extended toward the iron until the teacher would chide us to stand up straight and remember our place. In spring and fall, the windows would be propped open with sticks, letting in the smell of wild onions, mud, and the distant sound of farm work already underway. Recess was a daily relief, a signal marked by the teacher's bell commanding us outside, where the ground would fill up with shouts and laughter, games played with hoops, sticks, and whatever ball could be patched together from rags and string. Children raced and tumbled, their pent-up energy spent in glorious bursts, the scuffs and grass stains a badge of participation as much as any lesson learned inside. Not every day was fun. Sometimes a fight would break out. Sometimes the sky would threaten and keep us inside. But it was almost always a welcome respite, a chance to be a child before. Returning to the seriousness of study. Spelling bees were a grand affair, not just inside the classroom, but sometimes after supper at home. Whole families lined up to test each other on lists written out neat by the teacher or pulled from the reader's back pages. I remember evenings when we'd gather around the kitchen table, the lamp hissing above us, faces bright and eager as each person took their turn. Words tumbled out, easy ones at first, then harder, the sort that tripped up even the adults or raised a groan from my youngest sister, who'd only just learned her phonics that spring. Laughter came freely, especially when someone spelled catastrophe with a K or forgot how to double a consonant in happiness. No grudges held, though, only gentle teasing and the promise of another round the next night to keep the mind sharp and the heart light. Beyond the formal lessons, learning lived in the rhythm of the day and the presence of the teacher, that guiding hand who saw beyond the rules and sums. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, she'd read aloud stories of distant countries or the heroes of our own young nation, her voice coloring the words until we all but saw the landscapes and faces. At holiday times, we made garlands and cut snowflakes, set up a tiny tree, or baked gingerbread if flour and sugar could be spared, learning not just facts, but the rituals that knotted community together, remaking the schoolhouse as a place not just of rigor, but of belonging and hope. Walking home felt different than the journey that started the day. Lighter, buoyed by the promise of a well-earned meal, a patch of sunlight on the porch, or simply the certainty that you'd done your part, learned something new, and could face whatever tasks waited at home. Sometimes you'd share the walk with a friend, comparing answers, swapping marbles, or planning the next day's games. Other times, you'd hear the distant clang of a dinner bell calling from a neighbor's yard or pause to throw a stone into the creek, watching ripples circle out and fade, comforted by the notion that tomorrow would come with its own lessons and rewards. Schooling shaped our character as much as our minds. The way we learned to help others, to show patience when teaching or being taught by someone younger, the way we learned to own up to mistakes and celebrate small victories. There was no great rush to be done, no great anxiety about tests. The measure of success was steadiness, the slow growth from one page, one problem, one season to the next. A new set of chalk, a completed primer, a kind word from the teacher or a nod from a parent made all the difference, reassuring us that the effort mattered, even when the world outside seemed vast and unconcerned with our small triumphs. As we moved from autumn through winter and into spring, the schoolhouse itself seemed to age and come alive, scars on the desks deepening, the blackboard carrying a shadow of every lesson tried and erased, the windows clouded with the breath and dreams of another year's students. When the rains came and the roads grew thick with mud, sometimes only a handful would make it in, trudging through puddles or snow, but the day would go on all the same. Lessons adjusted to suit whoever showed up, stories shared twice so nobody missed out. Graduation, when it came, was less ceremony than a gentle passage. The teacher would gather us in, say a few words about what we'd accomplished, and send us home with new confidence, and maybe a fresh pencil or a book to start the summer. I sometimes think of those days, sunrise walks, chilly toes, the faint echo of chalk tapping on slate, and realize how much of myself was written there, in that small circle of benches and open books, in the sound of voices blending in recitation, in the little ceremonies of learning repeated until they settled deep enough to guide me all my days. If I close my eyes, I can still recall the exact feel of a well-worn reader in hand, the way the boards creaked underfoot as I came in late or lingered as the last to leave, the slow and hopeful certainty that if I just kept at it, everything worth knowing would reveal itself over time. There was never any rush to get ahead, only an expectation that you'd bring your best, that you'd learn what was set for you as well as you could, and extend a hand to those struggling beside you. That sense of mutual responsibility, the knowledge that your effort mattered not just for yourself, but for the community around you, laid a foundation stronger than any brick wall or iron gate. It's the kind of learning I wish more people could remember, the sort measured in stories shared, help given, and a lifetime of curiosity born on cold mornings and careful afternoons in the company of a good and decent teacher. If there's one thing that pulls up the old feeling of togetherness more than any other, it's the memories held in the ways we marked the passing of special days, the holidays that swept through each year, bringing a certain color and warmth to an ordinary life. I think back on the celebrations we stitched together out of what we had, steady customs, familiar songs, and food made with what could be gathered or grown. The sort of quiet joys measured more in laughter and kindness than in spectacle or grand gifts. Christmas was always the brightest spot in the middle of winter, the time when the whole house would fill with the scent of pine and wax, when the cold outside made the warmth of a lamplit parlor feel twice as sweet. There'd be a tree, usually fetched from the woods a few days before the holiday, chopped and dragged home by strong hands, trimmed at the base to fit just inside the brick-lined corner of the front room. No store-bought ornaments, just what we made ourselves. Popcorn strung with needle and thread, sometimes cranberries threaded between, making a cheery line that wound round and round the branches. Little paper figures cut from old catalogs and pieced together, stars folded and dipped in flour paste to catch the light and shine. Candles went on last, clipped to the sturdier limbs, lit only for a few magic moments under watchful eyes lest the flame should take to the needles. When evening came, we'd gather round and sing what we all knew. Carols, silent nights soft and hopeful, joy to the world when the mood was lively. Gifts were modest, knitted mittens, a scarf made in secret for weeks before, sometimes a small wooden toy that bore the marks of patience and care. Mostly, it was the gathering, the way the cold faded when voices mingled, that made the day mean more, weaving a promise that spring would come again and the family's line would stretch on and on. The 4th of July stood in bright contrast, a holiday marked not by quiet, but by the sound and spectacle of a whole town stretching itself out under sunny skies. Early in the morning, you'd hear the clatter of wagons and laughter bouncing from porch to porch, everyone busy with preparations, a pie cooling on every sill, flags set out along the picket fences, straw hats dusted and fit for the parade. Folks turned up by the dozens at the green in town, laying out blankets, baskets loaded with sandwiches, eggs, fried chicken, and the potato salad mixed just right for sharing. Someone always brought watermelon, split with a pocket knife, sticky hands and grins multiplying as slices passed from child to child. When the band struck up, marching through the main street with horns brassy and drums sharp, every heart would double its beat. Faces turned upward at the close, looking for fireworks that painted colors on the darkening summer sky. Each burst a cheer for the country, for freedom, for the sense that together we could weather any storm or lean year. By the time night drifted down, folks walked home slow, shoes scuffed from dancing, spirits lifted by the promise of neighbors and kin standing shoulder to shoulder, glad for what the day held. Thanksgiving bore a quieter satisfaction, a time when table and home did the hard work of celebration. Families traded visits, each bringing a dish or two, everyone making space for a few extra chairs around the board set up end to end. Turkey, roasted slow and basted all morning, ruled the day, with cornbread, potatoes, buttered beans, gravy rich and thick, and the cranberry sauce set in a shining bowl, plucked from wild vines if you had the luck and patience. When the meal was ready, heads bowed together in true gratitude, voices spilling thanks for each other and all the small mercies of field and flock. There was no rush. The meal rolled on with stories, laughter, and the contented hum of satisfied bellies. After, slippers and shawls came out, and smaller groups peeled away to walk and talk as the sun settled gold behind bare trees. The right sort of peace held for the days that followed, the household running on leftover pie and memories that rolled through the cold, promising another round next year. Easter brought its own gentle happiness, a culmination of spring's color and return. Preparations varied, but for us, it meant cleaning house, picking the earliest flowers, and gathering eggs for dyeing. Onion skins, beets, and strong coffee in chipped mugs did more to paint pastel colors than any packet ever could, and children watched in wide-eyed wonder as white eggs took on soft, earthy hues. Early sunrise meant a walk to church, new dresses stitched in secret stained with grass from the yard, baskets in hand for the hunt that would spill out after services, eggs hidden in tufts of clover, under porch steps, around the barn. The hunt brought laughter and the first real taste of green watercress, early lettuce in salad bowls at lunch, ham carved out on platters for sharing. Easter was hope, pure and simple, a reminder that no matter the hardships or sadness of winter, light and color and kindness found their way back each year. There were other moments, not named for any particular holiday, that still felt like celebrations. Birthday cakes baked plain and sweet for every family member, layers frosted with careful swirls, candles pressed one by one, laughter at the song sung a bit off-key, but faithful just the same. Birthdays were marked by simple treats, a square of chocolate, a jar of sweet preserves opened just for the occasion, an orange brought home from the market as a prize for the youngest child, cut in quarters and shared as if it were gold. New Year's built its own traditions out of togetherness. Watch night services drew neighbors in under oil lamps, prayers given for strength in the months ahead, faces upturned as the clock hands swept midnight. When fireworks or sparklers weren't possible, cider was passed, toasts raised in quiet corners, resolutions spoken more as hopes than demands. The old year was let go, the new one greeted patient and sure, with a faith that grew out of hard experience, a belief that the house would hold, the days would lengthen, and everyone present would live to see another spring. Harvest festivals marked the pulse of the agricultural year. Wheat stacked high, corn bundled and dried, fruit turned into cider for toasts at the churchyard or dance hall. Community tables groaned under pies, biscuits, roasted meat, apples baked whole in the embers. Games of horseshoes or sack races tumbled out on the grass. Those gatherings built bonds. Troubles eased for a few hours. Grudges softened over cups of sweet coffee. Old friendships renewed as the stars blinked awake above fall leaves. Smaller traditions took root in ordinary times. First snowfall meant melted chocolate and cinnamon bread, shoes lined near the stove to dry before afternoon reading. The beginning of planting meant a pot of stew simmering on a windowsill, neighbors stopping by to trade seeds or tips, everyone hopeful that the year's luck would turn in their favor. Childhood marked the end of school with picnics in the field, mothers exchanging folded napkins while fathers told stories of their own learning. Each tradition a thread winding through summers and winters, marking the simple act of living as something worthy of remembering. In every season, celebration was less about abundance and more about intention. What mattered most wasn't the number of gifts or the size of the spread, but the feeling of being seen and cherished, the sense that in coming together we could endure all things, take joy in small improvements, mourn together when loss came, and cheer each other forward toward new hope. Each gathering resisted loneliness, offered a counter to the hardships or isolation that marked harder years. Through songs, stories, dances, and prayers, time itself was given meaning, the passing from child to adult, from season to season, stitched with genuine care and fondness. I recall, with depth that aches sometimes, the feel of my hand lifting a child to string popcorn, the burst of January air at midnight, the laughter echoing across a field lit by bonfires, the taste of my mother's pie warm from the oven and served with words that only a family could understand. The exact details blur and fade, but the feeling never does. The knowledge that celebration, no matter how simple, gives us strength, fills us with belonging, and connects every memory to a reverence for the days we're given, for those who sit beside us, and for the quiet determination to make each year worthy of remembrance. Even now, when the world feels bigger and louder and more hurried, I find myself drawn back to those old rituals. The way a candle's flame can hush a room, the way a pie cooling on the sill speaks of patience and kindness, the way a song, sung without instruments or artifice, can draw a tired family nearer to warmth and home. In the end, it isn't the spectacle that endures, but the handmade, heartfelt, honest celebrations, the true reason to call a moment sacred and the best gift we ever gave one another. Night brings a certain hush to the world that makes reflection come easier, and as the lantern's light pools on these pages and the voices of the day fade to the soft ticking of an old clock or the distant wind brushing past the porch, I find myself drawn back through the years, feeling not just the memories of the 1910s, but the weight and goodness of time handed with care from one season and generation to the next. What has lingered for me, through all the stories and work, through the laughter caught at the table and the quiet labor in fields and kitchen, is not the spectacle of history, not the inventions or headlines or tall tales that sometimes fill encyclopedias, but the ordinary pulse of living, the days marked more by kindness and effort than by any reward that could be measured. The world then, slower and perhaps simpler, asked different things of a person. One's standing did not rest on ambition or the noise of getting ahead, but on a finer balance, the daily acts, repeated faithfully, that bound family and neighbor together in weather fair and foul. A man might start out with little, just a patch of earth, strong hands, and hope, but life taught him through long marches of morning into night that each day was a shape built from choices. How you treated those around you, the way you cared for the land as well as for the calf born in the night or the rosebush that needed pruning. How you mended the gate so the children could safely play and the livestock kept from wandering too far. How you looked for ways to share a loaf or a kind word, even when the cupboards were plotted lean and trouble joined you at the door. A person's real story was written in those acts. Years have their sweep, and sometimes their sorrow, that's true. Not all days are mild with peace. Illness strikes, crops fail, bitter words fly after long hours when tempers grow short. But the lessons that held strongest were not those shaped by want or hardship, but by steadfastness, the courage to wake again and try, the compassion to see others as kin rather than competition, the humility to accept what cannot be changed, and to find gratitude in what little could be. I remember the cold mornings most, the sound of boots on frosted boards, the sharp sting in the air, and the smile that came when a mug of coffee was pressed into my hand. I remember less the trouble and more the warmth, the fire that brought a family around in the evening, the gentle murmur of voices with no need to impress or flatter, only to be together and make the day whole. Love in those days was not declared loudly nor often, but it filled the rooms with each shared labor and each gesture of care. Father would mend a torn shirt while humming a tune from the old country. Mother would slip a few extra slices of bread onto my plate without a word. The youngest would curl up beside an older brother while the wind rattled the window and feel safe simply because the arm around their shoulder was steady. In a way that seems rare now, affection and comfort were woven into the fabric of living. The hands held in church, the stories whispered before sleep, the laughter spilling through the house as chores were finished and mischief forgiven. Courtship ran gentle and patient, marked by modest gifts and long walks at dusk. Marriage stood not as an escape or ambition, but as a joining, two people bent on weathering the long years beneath one roof. Their union a kind of partnership watched over by neighbors and children alike, sustained as much in hardship as in plenty. The land itself had a voice, speaking in the rise of new grass, the shifting of the creeks when rains fell hard, the steady return of birds, and the scent of earth warming after a thaw. Each season gave lessons, spring asking new energy, summer demanding labor and rewarding it with color and burst, autumn calling for the settling of accounts and the praise of harvest, winter pulling all things close until the promise of another beginning. You learned to wait when waiting was wise, to act when action was answered, to take solace in the wheel of time turning, knowing that nothing good or bad lasted forever, but that everything kept its place in the story written by patience and persistence. I remember the shape and sound of community, the way voices carried down the road at dusk, the echo of bells calling folk together for news or worship, the comfort found in gathering after illness, loss, or celebration. The doctor arrived by buggy and was welcomed with tea by the fire, Neighbors stopped to share pie or ask about the health of a newborn. Letters arrived and were read aloud with care and sometimes tears, holding all the distant loves in the smallest envelope. There was a sense then, hard for some to believe now, that people belonged not just to their immediate kin, but to a wider ring of connection. Each family marked by the others, each household shaped by the fortunes and failings that spread in ripples through every barn raising, every church picnic, every whispered word beneath the apple trees. If someone could not pay for service or help, it was given anyway, with the understanding that all would be cared for sooner or later. If a neighbor passed, the community would gather, bringing food in hands, sharing work as well as sorrow, knowing that the loss belonged to all, and so would the labor of restoring what was lost. The slow passing of hours made time feel different, the days built of small, deliberate acts rather than the rush from one obligation to the next. A walk to the store was reason enough to greet 3 neighbors and inquire after their crops, to rest on a fence and watch clouds forming for rain. The journey was as meaningful as the errand, and sometimes the destination was simply home again, arriving with a new story, a cutting of lilac, or the memory of a kindness offered freely at no cost. Children ran wild across fields in summer, their laughter unbroken by devices or interruption, imaginings built from found sticks and circles of stone. Adults watched, sometimes joining in, more often tending to work, but always alert to the pattern of life that spun itself in the lanes and woods beyond the doorstep. Evenings turned long and gentle with story. The telling itself was a treasure, a way of mapping the heart's memory onto the fabric of each day. Sometimes the tales were small, a mishap at the pump, a discovery in the attic, a bit of gossip turned harmless fun. Other times, they carried the weight of years, narrating the arrival of a tornado, the birth of a child, the heartbreak of a love lost young and mended slowly by the dawns that followed. The youngest would listen, eyes wide and sleepy. The oldest would nod, voice crackling with the feeling of truth. In all, there was the assurance that memory did not fade when shared, that even the smallest joys or sorrows gained permanence in the presence of those who cared to hear. Holidays, as I've said, marked more than mere passage of time. They divided the year into seasons of hope and renewal, threads of color running through the tapestry of days. Each celebration was an excuse to gather, to forgive, to remember what mattered most. Birthdays came humble and precious, the years counted as gifts given with faith and laughter. Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter. These were not the creation of commerce, but the outcome of love sharpened by tradition. Each day a chance to gather, to eat and sing, to watch the youngest grow and the elders reflect. The rituals might differ from house to house, but the meaning stayed constant. In every gathering there was the chance for grace, the opportunity to honor the past and lean, without bitterness, toward the future. The future itself was less a matter of plans and more a matter of readiness. Change arrived slow at first. The appearance of the postcard, the new automobile rumbling down the lane, the telephone connecting households in ways once hard to imagine. There was uncertainty, of course, the worry that old ways might fade, that labor would change, that the patterns of work and rest would shift with every invention. Yet in truth, what endured was not the method but the manner, the habits of care and resilience, the determination to meet each new test with the same patience and honesty learned from countless mornings at the pump, evenings at the table, years spent watching the land rise and fall in fidelity to the seasons. We marveled at change when it brought ease, cursed it still when it brought confusion, but always returned to the center: family, work, kindness, and the belief that all could be mended in time, if only by leaning together. Loss came and went, as it must. Each year carried its own share of grief, crops ruined, illness stalking a strong heart, dreams asked to wait. But neither joy nor pain lasted long alone. The sharing of each became a way of transforming both into memory, seasoning the hard days with the sweetness of compassion, marking the light ones with gratitude that needed no words. Birth and death, work and rest, repair and celebration. They wrote the story not just for me, but for thousands who passed, quietly, through days marked more by the weight of their goodness than by the brightness of their fortune. And as I sit here, hands marked by age and use, I feel this winding tale pressing forward, not toward regret, nor yearning, but toward a peace that settles strong against the changing world. I cherish the kitchen with its wood stove and lamp, the porch swing facing the twilight, the fields stretching out in the comfort of evening shadows. I honor the plowing, the mending, the laughter at the pump, and the music from the phonograph, even the quiet pause that comes after sorrow, teaching me that even the hardest ground yields to patience, and every day deserves its own closing, gentle and true. For me, the years do not end. They gather, layer on layer, shaping the life inside as much as the memory outside. And I tell these stories not to inspire nostalgia alone, nor to teach lessons with pointed words, but to offer what I have, a sense that goodness, once made and shared, never really leaves us. That the true shape of living is found not in the striving, but in the acceptance that days unfold as they will, and what remains is love, bound in every moment of work, kindness, forgiveness, and celebration. May you find comfort in your own hours, patience when trouble comes, and laughter strong enough to steady your journey. The world will turn, and times will change. But if you listen to the quiet, gentle pulse beneath all things, you'll carry with you what matters most, just as I have, through every season, every day, and every warm, ordinary memory worth telling.